A young woman stepped onto her private jet, her eyes full of pride and superiority. She barely looked at the crew, but when she noticed the pilot was a man of color, her expression shifted. With a faint grimace, she leaned toward her assistant and whispered, "How can I trust my life to someone like that?" What she didn't know was that within just a few hours, she would be forced to lower her voice, her eyes, and her ego, not because he was a skilled pilot, but because of who he truly was behind that uniform. Stay with us, because the ending of this story will challenge everything you thought you knew about judging people by their appearance. Olivia Beaumont, the only daughter of the Beaumont fashion dynasty, was no stranger to luxury. Her family's name was stitched into gowns worn by Hollywood royalty and whispered in the halls of Paris Fashion Week. At just 27, she carried herself like a queen in exile, elegant, sharp, and untouchable. Everything about her presence, from the sway of her designer coat to the cold glint in her eyes, spoke of privilege. That morning, she was scheduled to fly to an exclusive fashion summit in Aspen, a gathering of the wealthiest brand owners and designers in the world. The flight was meant to be flawless. Her assistant had arranged a top-tier private jet, complete with champagne, imported silk cushions, and her preferred playlist already queued. Olivia scanned the hangar as she approached the aircraft, her heels clicking against the polished floor, her expression unreadable but expectant. Then she saw him. The pilot stood tall by the stairs of the jet, clipboard in hand, dressed in a perfectly pressed uniform. His demeanor was composed, his smile polite. But what Olivia noticed first was the color of his skin. Her lips curled slightly, not into a smile, but into a line of disapproval. She slowed her steps, narrowed her eyes, and turned slightly toward her assistant, speaking just loud enough to be heard. "I thought only the best pilots were assigned to jets like these," she said, her voice dry, her meaning unmistakable. The pilot, Marcus, caught her tone. He looked her in the eye for a brief moment, then gave a small, respectful nod. His expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't respond. He simply turned back to his checklist, calm as ever. Olivia turned away, clearly annoyed. Her assistant, visibly uncomfortable, tried to reassure her that all credentials had been triple-checked. But Olivia was insistent. "I want someone else." "Now," she said firmly. "This isn't negotiable." Calls were made. Texts were fired off. But no replacement was available. Marcus was not just qualified, he was highly rated, trusted, and scheduled, and the plane was ready to depart. Olivia crossed her arms, jaw clenched, tapping her fingers against her clutch. For a few seconds, she stood still, eyes fixed on the plane as if trying to will it to disappear. Then, with a sharp inhale, she brushed past her assistant, climbed the stairs, and disappeared into the cabin. She didn't speak a word as she sat down, but her body language said everything. She didn't want to be there, and she didn't want him to be the one taking her there. She had no idea that this flight would become the moment she'd never forget. Barely 15 minutes into the flight, Olivia was already growing restless. She shifted in her seat, checked her watch, sighed, then did it all again. Her frustration had no clear target, but she made sure everyone around her felt it. The temperature was too warm, the sparkling water wasn't chilled enough, and the cushions were a little too firm for first-class standards, she said with a flick of her hand. Her voice was controlled but dripping with irritation. She didn't yell, but every comment carried the kind of disdain that didn't need volume to sting. Her assistant, sitting 2 seats away, tried to soothe her by reminding her of the agenda awaiting them in Aspen. Olivia barely listened. Her gaze moved toward the cockpit door, then back to her assistant. She lowered her voice, but not enough to be discreet. "Tell me," she said, crossing her legs slowly, "do you really think someone like that has the precision to handle this aircraft? It's not just about training, you know." It's about upbringing. Some people, no matter how hard they try, just weren't born for elegance. The assistant tensed, lips pressing into a thin line. He glanced toward the front of the jet, unsure if anyone had heard. "Olivia," he whispered, "maybe you should lower your voice. This isn't the place." She raised an eyebrow and laughed softly, as if amused by his concern. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm just making an observation. Not everyone is meant to operate something that costs more than their entire life savings." Marcus, seated calmly in the cockpit, heard every word. His hands remained steady on the controls. Not a single muscle in his face moved. He looked through the mirror briefly, then turned his attention back to the flight panel. There was no reaction. No response. Just silence. A few minutes later, one of the flight attendants approached Olivia's seat with a soft smile. She leaned in slightly and said, with gentle professionalism, "Miss Beaumont, we kindly ask that all guests refrain from personal comments during the flight. We want to make this experience enjoyable for everyone." Olivia didn't flinch. She slowly turned her head, met the attendant's eyes, and said in a flat tone, "I'm paying for this flight. I believe that gives me the right to speak freely." The words dropped heavy between them. The attendant simply nodded, still smiling, then walked away without another word. Her assistant looked down, pretending to review documents, though nothing on his screen moved. Olivia leaned back, feeling victorious, unaware that her every word had just carved a deeper crack into the thin ice beneath her. She was too wrapped up in her entitlement to realize she was slowly burying herself in it. The jet trembled slightly as it passed through a patch of light turbulence. It wasn't serious, just the kind of shake every seasoned traveler had experienced 100 times before. But Olivia's fingers immediately gripped the armrest. Her eyes widened, and her breath caught for a moment. She looked around quickly, as if expecting someone to panic with her. No one did. Marcus's voice came over the speaker, smooth and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are encountering minor turbulence. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. Everything is under control." His tone was steady, calm, the kind that made people trust him even without seeing his face. But Olivia didn't look convinced. She shook her head and scoffed. Her voice rose sharply. "Under control," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I don't want to die in the air just because someone wasn't properly qualified to fly a private jet." A hush fell over the cabin. A few heads turned toward her. One older gentleman, seated across the aisle and clearly someone used to discretion, looked directly at her. "Miss," he said, "maybe it's best to keep your thoughts to yourself. Some of us are trying to have a peaceful flight." Olivia glared at him but didn't reply. Her assistant shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly wishing he could vanish. Marcus's voice returned, this time softer but firm. "I assure you, Miss Beaumont, I am more than capable of getting you to your destination safely. But if you would prefer a different method of arrival, I could open the door and let you out now." The words hit like a jolt. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't sarcastic. He was calm, polite, and deadly serious. There was a pause, long and heavy. Even the engine seemed quieter. Olivia's lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. Her face flushed. For once, she didn't have a comeback. All eyes were on her now, but not with admiration. Her silence echoed louder than her words. The power she thought she had suddenly slipped through her fingers. She sat back slowly, folded her arms, and stared straight ahead. The confrontation was over, but the damage was done. And it wasn't the turbulence that had shaken her the most. It was the realization that control, real control, doesn't come from money, status, or the loudest voice in the room. After the uncomfortable silence that followed the confrontation, Olivia's assistant quietly pulled out his tablet. He had seen enough to know that Marcus was no ordinary pilot, and something about the way he held himself, calm, confident, unshaken, made him curious. As Olivia sat stiffly in her seat, pretending to read a magazine, her assistant typed Marcus's name into a search engine. Within seconds, articles began to appear. The first few headlines surprised him. Decorated Air Force pilot opens private aviation firm. From war zones to private skies, Marcus J. Bennett redefines leadership. He scrolled further, eyes widening. There were photos of Marcus in uniform, standing beside high-ranking officers, even receiving medals. One piece revealed that Marcus had served over a decade in the military, completing multiple international missions with distinction. He didn't stop there. Another article outlined Marcus's post-military journey. After leaving the Air Force, he earned 2 advanced degrees in aeronautical science. Then he became a certified flight instructor, teaching hundreds of new pilots across the country. He was even invited as a guest speaker at aviation conferences and had published research on aviation safety and ethics. What caught the assistant most off guard was an in-depth profile in a leading business magazine. It called Marcus a quiet force in the skies and listed him among the top rising figures in private aviation. There was even a full-page photo, Marcus in a tailored suit, standing on the runway beside one of the jets from his own fleet. The assistant blinked, stunned. "He's not just a pilot," he muttered, almost to himself. "He might be the smartest person on this plane." He leaned slightly toward Olivia and whispered, "I think you should see this." But Olivia barely turned her head. Her lips tightened. "I don't care what the internet says," she snapped. "He's still just a pilot." Her assistant sighed, unsure whether to push further. Olivia returned her gaze to the window, refusing to let go of her beliefs. Despite the facts in front of her, she clung tightly to the story she'd already written in her mind. One where she was above, and he was below. She didn't realize that truth, like turbulence, has a way of shaking people loose when they least expect it. While Olivia remained silent, still staring out the window with arms folded tight, her assistant found himself approached by one of the flight attendants. She had a warm voice, calm and steady, the kind that carried quiet stories without needing drama. Leaning slightly toward him, she spoke softly, "You're curious about Marcus, aren't you?" The assistant nodded, unsure if he should admit it. She smiled, just a little, and said, "He's not the kind of man who talks about himself. But if you knew where he came from, you'd understand why he carries himself the way he does." She went on, her tone respectful, almost proud. Marcus had grown up in a rough part of Detroit, raised by a single mother who worked 2 jobs. They barely had enough for rent, let alone dreams. He was teased for his quiet nature, dismissed by teachers, underestimated by nearly everyone. But even as a child, he would spend hours watching planes fly overhead, sketching wings and engines in his notebook when other kids were out playing. He didn't just dream about flying, he studied it. Obsessed over it. He graduated at the top of his high school class and earned a full scholarship to one of the nation's top aviation academies. He was the only black student in his program, the attendant said quietly, and some of the professors didn't think he'd last a semester. He graduated with honors. After college, Marcus joined the Air Force. There, he proved himself again, mission after mission. His name started circulating in elite pilot circles, not because he chased attention, but because he never cracked under pressure. He flew emergency evacuations, combat missions, and disaster relief operations, always calm, always focused. When he left the military, he could have joined any commercial airline. Instead, he built something of his own. With his savings and a small loan, he founded a private aviation company. He named it Sky Legend, not because he saw himself as a legend, but because he wanted the skies to be a place where stories like his could take flight. She paused, glanced toward the front of the cabin, then added one final detail. The jet you're sitting on? It belongs to Sky Legend. He doesn't just fly it. He owns it. The assistant sat back, speechless. He looked over at Olivia, who still hadn't turned around, still unaware that the man she'd mocked wasn't just her pilot. He was the owner of everything around her, and the architect of his own rise. As the plane began its slow descent, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, and a sense of calm settled over the passengers. But then, a soft chime rang out, and Marcus's voice returned over the intercom, clear, steady, and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us today. We'll be landing shortly. And before we do, I'd like to extend a personal invitation to Miss Olivia Beaumont. Upon arrival, you are welcome to visit the operations lounge for a brief meeting, should you have a moment." The words were polite, almost routine, but something about the way Marcus said them felt different. There was weight behind them, intention, purpose. Olivia raised her eyebrows and let out a dry laugh. "Seriously? Now he wants a meeting? What is this, some weird attempt at making a point?" She leaned back in her seat and rolled her eyes. Her tone was more annoyed than surprised. Her assistant, still shaken by everything he'd learned, turned toward her with hesitation. "Maybe you should go," he said quietly. "Maybe you should just hear him out. Or, maybe even say something." Olivia turned sharply. "Apologize," she scoffed. "To a pilot? Don't forget who we are." He didn't reply. The plane descended further, smooth and flawless. The wheels touched down gently, not even a bump. It was the kind of landing that told you everything about the pilot: calm under pressure, deeply skilled, focused. Around Olivia, other passengers murmured words of appreciation. One woman said, "That was the best landing I've had in years." Another clapped softly and nodded toward the cockpit. "He's impressive," someone whispered. But Olivia stayed quiet. She adjusted her sunglasses, straightened her coat, and grabbed her handbag with practiced elegance. Her heels clicked as she stood. Her face wore a look that blended defiance with pride. She didn't look back as she stepped off the plane, still convinced the world revolved around her status. She had no idea that the real moment, the one that would change everything, was still waiting just a few steps ahead. The operations lounge was quiet, modern, and elegantly designed. Soft lights reflected off polished floors, and large windows framed the private runway outside. Marcus stood calmly near the center of the room, hands loosely clasped in front of him. He looked perfectly at ease, dressed not in his pilot's uniform now, but in a tailored navy suit. His posture was relaxed, yet commanding. Beside him stood Olivia's assistant and a uniformed airport staff member. Both looked serious, almost tense, as if anticipating a moment that could shift the tone of the entire day. The air was still, charged with something unspoken. Then Olivia walked in. She moved with her usual confidence, heels echoing across the floor, sunglasses still in place. Her eyes scanned the room. The sleek decor didn't impress her. Her gaze landed on Marcus, and she gave a small, mocking smile. "Well," she said, "this must be where the lecture happens. Should I sit, or is this going to be short?" Marcus didn't react to the sarcasm. He simply nodded and said, in the same calm tone he had used throughout the flight, "Miss Beaumont, I just wanted to personally thank you for choosing the services of my company today." Olivia blinked. She tilted her head. "Your company," she repeated, the word slow, uncertain. Without another word, Marcus reached into his inner jacket pocket and handed her a small, elegant business card. She took it, eyes still on him, then glanced down. The card read, "Marcus J. Bennett, Chief Executive Officer, Sky Legend Aviation." For a few seconds, Olivia didn't move. Her fingers held the card lightly, but her entire body seemed frozen. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The realization hit her all at once, swift and merciless. The man she had judged, insulted, and dismissed was not just her pilot. He was the owner of the jet. The founder of the company. The mind behind the very flight she had assumed control over. A quiet flush crept up her neck. Her sunglasses couldn't hide the shift in her expression, the shock, the disbelief, and the first flicker of something unfamiliar, humility. Everything she thought she knew about him shattered. And every assumption she had made now felt like a weight she could no longer carry. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. Olivia stood still, clutching the business card like it might burn through her fingers. Her cheeks turned visibly red, the color creeping up beneath her flawless foundation. Her confident posture faltered. For the first time that day, she looked genuinely unsure of herself. Marcus didn't smirk. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for an apology. He simply stood where he was, calm and unshaken. His tone remained soft as he looked at her and asked, "Was there something about me that made you believe I wasn't capable of doing my job?" The words weren't harsh. They weren't meant to humiliate. But they landed with weight. Olivia swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "No," she said, eyes lowered. I didn't know." Marcus didn't look away. "Exactly," he said quietly. "You didn't know, because you didn't want to know." That sentence stayed in the air like a mirror. Olivia didn't speak. Her head dipped slightly, her shoulders no longer squared in arrogance but sloping in quiet recognition. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was something deeper. A crack in the wall she had built around her image of the world. Her assistant stepped forward, sensing the moment was quickly unraveling. "Mr. Bennett," he said politely, "we sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding." Miss Beaumont had no intention of. Marcus held up a hand, still smiling. "It's all right. There's no need for a performance," he said gently. Then, looking back at Olivia, he added, "I only ask that next time, you judge someone by what they do, not by the color of their skin." He didn't wait for a reply. He didn't need one. The message had already landed. Olivia remained silent, staring down at the floor. The card was still in her hand, but now it felt heavier than it had any right to be. He had given her nothing but professionalism and kindness. And she had given him doubt, disdain, and disrespect. Now all that remained was the bitter taste of her own pride. Olivia took a slow breath, then walked toward Marcus. Her steps were steady, but her confidence had faded. The proud tilt of her chin was gone, replaced by something more hesitant, more human. She tried to maintain composure, to keep her usual grace intact, but it was clear to anyone watching, she was no longer in control of the room. When she finally stood in front of Marcus, she avoided his eyes for a moment, then looked up and spoke. Her voice wavered. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I was out of line." The words didn't come easy. She had spent years surrounded by people who excused her behavior, who never asked her to reflect. But now, in front of the man she had misjudged, she found herself struggling for dignity. Marcus didn't hesitate. He extended his hand, and his voice was warm. "It's all right," he said. "Everyone has something to learn. Sometimes, it just takes a little turbulence to remind us what respect really looks like." Olivia took his hand. She held it for a moment longer than she needed to, then asked softly, "You're really the owner of all this?" He nodded. "I built it from the ground up," he replied. Then he turned and walked away without waiting for admiration, without needing her to say more. Olivia stood still, watching his back as he moved through the lounge with quiet confidence. For the first time in her life, she felt small. Not belittled, but humbled. Her assistant stepped beside her and spoke just above a whisper. Sometimes, it takes being embarrassed to finally grow up. She didn't argue. She didn't laugh it off. She simply nodded, eyes still on the door Marcus had just exited. There was nothing left to defend. Only something to reflect on. The days following the encounter left Olivia unusually quiet. Her mind, once filled with meetings, brand launches, and curated perfection, now circled around one name, Sky Legend. For the first time, she wasn't searching for market data or influencer partnerships. She was searching for truth. Late into the night, she sat with her tablet and began reading everything she could find about the company. Articles praised the exceptional quality of service. Customer testimonials spoke of trust and safety. But what drew her in most were the stories about Marcus himself. She read about his upbringing, about the obstacles he had faced. The neighborhoods he had grown up in, the doors that had been slammed in his face, the quiet strength he had carried without asking for applause. She found interviews where he talked not about success, but about discipline, kindness, and dignity. Each word felt grounded, lived, earned. One quote stayed with her. Respect is not given because of a title or a suit. It is earned by how we show up, especially when no one expects much from us. Olivia read that line again and again. And with it came a quiet discomfort. Not because she disagreed, but because she finally saw herself clearly, not the polished version she projected, but the one who had judged too quickly, spoken too carelessly. She opened her laptop and began writing. The email wasn't long. But it was honest. "I owe you more than an apology," she wrote. "Thank you for teaching me something I should have learned long ago, and thank you for doing it without preaching. You showed me what dignity looks like." A day later, Marcus replied. His message was short, warm, and to the point. Real change starts when we're brave enough to face ourselves. Keep going. That line stayed with her. From that moment, Olivia began shifting how she viewed the world, and herself. She listened more. Questioned more. Chose her words with intention. It wasn't a grand transformation. It was slow, quiet, and often uncomfortable. But it was real. Weeks passed, and with them came a quiet shift in how Olivia was perceived, and how she saw herself. When Sky Legend announced a major promotional event to celebrate its rapid growth and new partnerships, Olivia received a personal invitation. Not as a celebrity. Not as a client. But as a guest of honor. The event was elegant yet grounded, much like the man who hosted it. Industry leaders gathered in a sleek hangar transformed into a stage. Aircraft engines glinted under soft lighting, and large banners told the story of Sky Legend's journey from dream to empire. When Olivia walked in, there was a stir. Not because of her designer gown, but because of who she had chosen to stand beside. On stage, she took the microphone, paused for a moment, and then began. She didn't read a speech. She didn't hide behind polite statements. Instead, she told the story. Her story. From the judgment on the plane to the truth in the lounge. She spoke of her assumptions, her discomfort, and the lesson she had never expected to learn at 30,000 feet. As she finished, Marcus stepped forward and joined her on stage. He looked at her with quiet respect, then turned to the audience. "It takes more strength to admit you're wrong than to pretend you never were," he said. "She's braver than most people I've met." Applause followed, not out of politeness, but from genuine admiration. Then came the final moment. Together, Olivia and Marcus signed a joint partnership agreement. Sky Legend would collaborate with the Beaumont Fashion House for a new luxury branding campaign, one built not just on image, but on story, humility, and progress. Photos from the event spread quickly online. Not just of jets or fashion, but of two people who had once stood on opposite sides of pride and misunderstanding, now working together, side by side. Their journey resonated. People commented, shared, and reflected. It wasn't just a business deal. It was proof that change is possible. That listening matters. That dignity doesn't come from where you stand in a room, but from how you treat those around you. What began as judgment ended in mutual respect. Not Pilate and Heiress. Not power and privilege. Just two people who chose to grow. The hum of the jet was soft and steady, a sound both calming and familiar. In this new flight, Olivia was no longer seated in silence behind a wall of pride. She sat beside Marcus, not as a client, not as a skeptic, but as someone transformed by perspective. The clouds outside drifted slowly past the window. The sky, endless and open, mirrored the quiet space between them, a space now filled with mutual respect. Olivia turned to him, her voice thoughtful. "The world made me believe in the wrong standards," she said. "It taught me to look at labels, at titles, and make decisions before hearing anyone speak." Marcus didn't rush to answer. He glanced out the window, then back at her. "But we get to redefine those standards," he said gently. "It starts with what we choose to unlearn." They both looked forward, eyes fixed on the horizon. Up here, above the noise of judgment and expectation, the sky held no divisions. There were no rows, no roles, no ranks. Just space, and the freedom to see more clearly. Olivia sat a little straighter, not from pride, but peace. She had grown. She had let go of a version of herself that had once needed to feel above others to feel valuable. Now, she listened more. She asked more. And she spoke with care. Marcus didn't seek praise for what he had done. He continued showing up with the same grace, the same quiet power. He didn't preach. He lived his truth, and in doing so, gave others permission to find theirs. The story of their first flight had traveled far. People still spoke about it. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. It reminded them that growth doesn't always start with kindness. Sometimes, it starts with discomfort, with shame, with silence. But it can lead somewhere honest. Somewhere better. Their story remains a quiet reminder of something simple but easy to forget. You cannot judge a person by the first thing you see. It is hard to believe that one flight could shift someone's entire perspective. But sometimes, it only takes a moment, a small crack in the surface, to let the light in. What began as tension, pride, and prejudice slowly unraveled into something more powerful. Something real. Through what seemed like discomfort and confrontation, Olivia discovered the quiet strength of humility. She learned that respect is not owed to status, wealth, or appearance, but to character, to actions, and to the courage to rise above judgment. Marcus never asked for approval. He never demanded recognition. He simply lived with integrity and proved that true leadership doesn't raise its voice, it raises its standard. Olivia's journey reminds us of something important. When we choose to see beyond our assumptions, we open the door to connection, to understanding, to change. So ask yourself, how many people have you looked past? How many chances have you missed to see someone for who they really are, instead of who you thought they were? If you've ever been in a moment like this, or witnessed something similar, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Your story might inspire someone else to rethink their own. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others. Let's keep conversations like this going. Let's help more people see the world, and each other, a little more clearly. Thank you for staying with us to the very end. We'll see you in the next story, where anything can happen.